Welcome to this section of the National EMS Academy's online EMT program. This is the first of a two-part lesson on the respiratory system. In this lesson, I'm going to review the basic pulmonary anatomy and physiology. This is an extremely important subject for EMTs. We are often required to manage breathing issues, and a thorough knowledge of this system is key to our success. First, let's look at the two primary divisions of this system. Those two divisions are the airway and the lungs. The airways are here, and these are the pipes through which the air enters and exits the body. The lungs here are the functional area of the pulmonary system, and this is where gas exchange actually occurs. Now let's take a little closer look at that airway. It can be broken into two segments, the upper and the lower airways. I'm going to use this illustration here to show you the parts of the upper airway. First, the upper airway extends from the nasal cavity here down to the lower border of the larynx here. So basically everything between these two lines is the upper airway. Now I'm going to label the parts. Here's the nasal cavity. Here's the oral cavity. And this area directly behind is collectively called the pharynx. We can divide it into three areas: the nasopharynx behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx. Some books refer to this as the hypopharynx, but that's down here toward the bottom. Finally, we have the larynx. Most people refer to this structure as the voice box because it contains the vocal cords and actually permits us to speak. Now, please note that a lot of these structures are also considered part of the digestive tract. Now let's go over the lower airway structures. They are the trachea here. This is what most people call the windpipe. The trachea then divides into two branches called bronchi. The bronchi then divide into smaller and smaller tubes referred to as bronchioles. Notice that the bronchioles are actually inside the borders of the lungs. Bronchioles will continue to divide into smaller and smaller airways until they finally reach the small air sacs where gas exchange occurs. These small sacs are arranged in clusters and look a lot like grapes. They are called alveoli. Now let's really zoom in, and I'm going to show you how this gas exchange works. This diagram shows one alveolus and its surrounding capillary. Now the cardiovascular system is going to deliver blood from all parts of the body to the lungs. This blood is very low in oxygen and high in CO2, or carbon dioxide. The oxygen is low because it has entered all the body's cells. The CO2 was created in the cells and has entered the bloodstream and is now being returned to the lungs. Now the air entering the lungs when we breathe in has exactly the opposite concentrations. It is high in O2 and low in CO2. Since the capillary and the alveoli walls are so thin, the gases can diffuse through them. So the oxygen will move into the blood vessel and the CO2 will move into the alveoli. In part 2, I'm going to get much more in depth on diffusion, but we'll put that off till next time. Now I want to wrap up this part of the lesson with just a brief discussion of how the anatomy of children differs from that of adults. Later you're going to learn that these differences will require us to change our treatment approaches when we're taking care of infants or kids. First, the mouth and the nose are much smaller. Well, that's no big surprise, right? But the tongue is actually bigger in proportion to the size of the oral cavity. That means children are much more prone to airway obstruction by the tongue. Children also have much narrower airways that are more prone to obstruction. They're also very fragile, so we're going to need to be very careful when we do airway management on kids because we can actually injure the airways. Finally, the chest wall is very thin and poorly developed. That means very young children are what we call diaphragmatic breathers. Adults move air in and out using the intercostal muscles of the chest and the special internal breathing muscle we call the diaphragm. Kids don't get much help from their intercostals. They're much more dependent on their diaphragm. Again, in part 2, we'll get into this a little bit more in depth. All right, that's it for this section. We've gone over the pertinent anatomy. Check out part 2, and I'm going to get into a lot more depth in terms of the physiology and how all this stuff works.